Well, hello, everyone. My name is Richard Portelance. I'm your host for the EdGate Powers podcast. I'm excited today. We have Keven Ellis from the Texas Board of Education joining us. Just so everybody's aware, we are doing a webinar in December, on December 17th. The information will be linked below in the description. You can join Keven and Hillary Knutson from Whiteboard Advisors and Lisa O'Master, the CEO of Learning.com, when we're going to talk about how the shifting perspectives of the paradigm shift that's taking place at the state level on standards and the skills needed for the future of work. So today we're going to talk about how Texas is leading the way and preparing every student for college, career, and civic life. Keven, could you give us a little intro and then we'll dig into some questions?
Absolutely, Rich, and thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to be here. As you mentioned, my name's Keven Ellis. I'm from Lufkin, Texas, which is in East Texas. I served on my local school board here in Lufkin for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, was president of the board during that time. And in 2017, I was elected to the Texas State Board of Education, and I'm just wrapping up my 9th year on the board. I was appointed by Governor Abbott chair of the board for 4 of those years, from 2019 to 2023. Also currently a commissioner with the Education Commission of the States. And just last week, I wrapped up a term as chair of the National Association of State Boards of Education. So again, happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you for your service, first of all. And Dr. Ellis, you have a distinguished background before you joined educational boards, and it kind of made this part of your passion. So I think it's important that we acknowledge people who sign up to do these things. It's important that we have representation at the district level, at the state level. So I appreciate what you do. Let's set the scene a little bit. Texas has made a priority that every student is future ready, ready for college, career, military, and as your TEA's mission states. Could you begin by telling us how you emphasize this emerging at the state level, what the role of the State Board of Education played in advancing the agenda?
Sure. I would go back probably about 10 years ago. The Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board developed the 60 by 30 plan. And what that was is that 60% of Texans ages 25 to 34 by the year 2030 would have a certificate or a degree to support the economic future of our state. Following COVID and changing workforces, things changed, but the coordinating board did not back away from that goal, but they changed it to have what they called a talent strong Texas. So they expanded the age that we were focusing on from 25 to age 64, and also added post-secondary credentials of value. Under those metrics in 2019, we're at 48%, 2022 up to 52%. So we are on track to meet our goal by 2030 to be 60%, to have some sort of certificate, degree, or credential of value. So that plan was developed by the coordinating board, but higher ed can't do this by themselves. TEA, the Texas Education Agency, also has adopted this goal. And the TEA has 4 strategic principles. Number 1, we want to make sure we recruit, support, retain teachers and principals. We're improving our lowest performing schools. We're building a foundation for reading and math and connecting high school to college and career. And I think those 2 last levers, the building the foundation for reading and math and connecting high school to college and career, is really where the state board has a lot of authority over.
Okay. And when we talk about success in Texas for students, what does it look like in context of the state? How has the board articulated or officially framed that vision for Texas students?
Well, when I think we're looking at success, we have to measure it. There's a saying that we say here in Texas that what gets measured gets accomplished. And so we've got to look at the data. And some of the things we look at the TEA and at the State Board of Education is things like kindergarten readiness. We're, of course, looking at 3rd grade reading and 3rd grade math. We're looking at 8th grade reading and 8th grade math. Big focus on CCMR, which is our term for college and career military readiness. So we're looking at high school completion. looking at college enrollment, college completion, and those are the specific metrics that the education agency looks at, and we framed our goals on the State Board of Education in alignment with that. Now, we look at things more at the level of working on policy on the state board. I would say our Commissioner of Education, Mike Morath, has more of a daily interaction with local education agencies. But I think when we look at this, we look at it globally. Governor Abbott has prioritized this focus globally by forming the what we call a tri-agency coalition. And that's the Texas Education Agency, the Higher Ed Coordinating Board, and also the Texas Workforce Commission. So a lot of the goals that have come forth from that tri-agency coalition are the goals that the Texas State Board is working on.
Okay. And it's interesting that you frame up your goals as including military. So as a driver of opportunity for students, which is terrific. You don't hear that from many other states.
Yeah, I think on that point right there, I mean, all our students should be ready for either college or career or military. We haven't really found any other goals past that. They need to be doing one of those three things. And so that's I think, an important metric to look at.
How does the vision tie to the board's broader goal of student success in the state of Texas, academically, socially, economically, as an engaged citizen?
Yeah, that's a good question. And when I look at success, I'm looking at our students graduating with opportunities. And we need to have all of those things that you mentioned there to have true opportunities, obviously academically. That's what all those metric goals that I just talked about focus on. So of course, we have to have academic success, but we also have to look at things, you mentioned socially. We got to have safe learning environments. Our state, along with, I know, a lot of other states around the country, have just implemented a cell phone ban, and ours is complete K through 12, bell to bell, in between classes, a complete cell phone ban. Anecdotally, that's been very promising, but I'm curious to see how this comes out. Talked to a lot of teachers that are really happy with it. The students, I think, are getting accustomed to it. And it's nice that, we're hearing them say it's nice not to have to worry about what's going on in social media. Actually, a little pushback from the parents. I think the parents are not used to being able to text their kids and say what's going on. So I think overall that's going to be a good thing. But again, socially they have to be in a good place. And then economically, of course, we know that college completion increases economic outcome, but we also have to look at other things. What certificate of values are important for them. And when we look at those, what the cost of those are, not just the real cost, but opportunity cost of getting those certificates. So those are all the types of things that I look at when I think about how we're going to make our kindergarten students in 13 years grow up to be a productive member of our society.
Sounds like really good goals. I know my wife's a high school art teacher, and they've here in Connecticut, we put a ban in for cell phones as well. So the kids are putting their phones in a pouch at the beginning of class. A little resistance, but seems like things are moving in the right direction. It's certainly the attention seems to be coming around where kids are understanding how to focus without having that live device in their pocket. So it's interesting.
One thing I heard along those lines is that one teacher said our lunchrooms are now noisier, and that's a good thing. Kids are actually talking to each other, and not just staring at their phones the whole time. So I think it's going to be a good thing.
Yeah, me too. So talking about policy and practice, let's go to standards alignment because that plays into your TEKS, right? How are those academic expectations evolving to reflect the broader competencies we associate with future-ready learners, such as critical thinking, effective communication, and adaptability?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I'm always careful with acronyms because I know probably most of your listeners are educators or in the education field, but we of course have some that are specific here for Texas. And as you mentioned, the TEKS are our Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. Those are our curriculum standards that are completely adopted by the State Board of Education. Our Texas Education Agency doesn't have any authority over those. The state has given that specifically to the state board. So when you talk about TEKS, that's what we're talking about there. But broadly, all those things that you talked about are woven throughout the TEKS. When we talk about critical thinking, our social studies requires the content and critical thinking skills to make sure that those two things are taught together. We're not just teaching them content, but also how to think critically. When we look at English language arts, we have in there that students need to be critical thinkers to adapt to the evolving nature of language and literacy. You mentioned communication. Communication is also important across subjects. We have in our math standards that students need to be able to effectively communicate mathematical ideas, reasoning, so forth. I mentioned social studies, but we also have communication and social studies that there's an expectation they're able to communicate those social studies skills in various forms, whether that's oral, visual, or written, and even in science that students are able to communicate their findings. So I think you'll see all of those skills woven broadly across our TEKS. Additionally, back probably about 5 years ago, the board adopted character traits that are to be taught K through 12. When we did that, we didn't put them within a certain subject, like we didn't put them in ELAR or social studies. We put them as a separate chapter of student expectations that have to be taught. So districts have the authority to figure out where they want to teach those, but things specifically like trustworthiness, responsibility, caring, and good citizenship are what we looked at when we did our character traits.
No, that those are really important traits. And just for full transparency, EdGate is working with Texas on ingesting TEKS and doing alignment work and working with several edtech companies and publishers to make sure that there's alignment with those with the content that goes into Texas, as well as the standards, the TEKS that are in place. So I just want to make sure the readers understand that there are some connections there.
Yeah, and that's an important point too that I brought up on the character traits is, if you're a publisher and you're looking, what do I need for math? You go to our math chapter of the TEKS and you have that laid out, or social studies or science, but also make sure people are looking at this character traits because districts have to teach those somewhere. It's up to the district where, but I think that's beneficial if a publisher is able to add those in to their programs, because that is a responsibility of districts to be able to do that.
Okay, good point. Let's talk a little bit about CTE. You've been a national leader in career and technical education, Texas, and the Foundation High School program with endorsements. How have CTE frameworks and endorsement options helped advance the state's vision of what it means a graduate to be future ready?
Sure. And of course, with our CTE programs of study, we want to make sure that they relate to a high wage job, an in-demand job, and a high skill job. Those are all the things that, of course, Perkins 5 required us to do. But I know our board dove very deeply into that work when we looked at our programs of study. And we're continually doing that as we revise our CTE courses. We have hundreds and hundreds of CTE courses. And normally when we revise subjects, say it be math, well, you're just going to focus completely on math K through 12. But with CTE, there are so many courses. Years ago, but before I was on the board tried to revise all those at one time, and they literally had notebooks from the floor up to about their chest level when you had all those hundreds of courses in the programs. And so what we've decided to do as a board is to look at those on kind of a rolling basis. So every year we're grabbing a chunk of those CTE courses and revising them, and things change in the field often, so we have to make sure that we keep up with that. But we're making sure that all our programs of study have the appropriate level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 courses. And then you mentioned the endorsements. That's part of our graduation requirement. So we have the standard graduation requirements, but also endorsements if they meet certain things. And there's an endorsement in different fields. And it may be in hospitality, it may be in STEM, it may be in technology, all those different areas. So it allows students to be focused on an area that's of interest to them, and also requires to earn an endorsement. You have to have that 4th math credit that we also know is very, very critical.
Last time we talked, when we spoke, we were talking a little bit about the different nomenclature that does exist, and we were when we talk with Hillary later and we do the webinar, we're going to talk about a portrait of a graduate. Does the future ready components of what you just spoke about kind of marry up to some of those things? I know you don't have that nomenclature, so we're going to try to make that relationship in Texas of how you guys talk about that as Hillary and Lisa talk about portrait of a graduate elsewhere.
Yeah, and that'll be an interesting road to go down to see, because I think honestly we haven't like branded something specifically as some states have with a portrait of a graduate or a portrait of a learner or so forth. But I think the goals are still inside there.
Yeah, I agree. So In terms of assessment, and I know you have the STAAR program, it's one thing to define student success, as we just did, another to measure it. How is Texas thinking about assessment, measurement, and accountability in ways that go beyond traditional STAAR testing or conventional academic metrics?
Sure. And again, to level set for those who aren't from Texas, the STAAR test is our state test. And it's funny. I don't find a lot of people who love the STAAR test when I'm talking with parents and students and just people in the community. Everybody seems to hate the test. And something I tell them a lot of times, I said, I don't think you hate the STAAR test. You hate the accountability system that goes with the STAAR test, because people get frustrated with that. They get frustrated with their local community. We have an A through F system. Being all the work that they do, all the work that comes from that school district being narrowed down to a single letter grade, like a B or an A or a C. So I think that's a frustration, because the STAAR test, the accountability test, or the assessment test is so closely related. But I think we've said the phrase assessment and accountability so many times together that we think it's the same thing. And, it's truly not. The assessment test is very critical in its own right. We need to know whether Johnny and Susie know the material we want them to know. But the accountability is really looking at what the adults in the room are doing, and are they providing the type of educational opportunities for our students. But all that being said, the STAAR test was actually repealed in Texas just a couple months ago in the second special session that the legislature had this year. They have replaced it. You talked about how we're going to measure student success. Ironically, in the statute, it's the new tool is called the Student Success Tool, the SST. We'll see if we come up with a catchy acronym for that. We always tend to do that. But a couple highlights of the new testing system that will be moving forward in Texas is, instead of a single end of the year test, they will have it now a beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year for grades 3 through 8. Our high school end of course exams can also do that, but they're not required to have the beginning of the year and the middle of the year. They are required to be shorter assessments and also adaptive for the students. The end of the year results are required to be available to the school districts within 48 hours. So many times we didn't get the results back until during the summer. The kid's gone at that point, and you've missed the opportunity. The bill required a reduction in total testing time, even though there will be 3 tests throughout the year. The total time that's tested during a school year has to be reduced. In addition to the actual state assessment that I was talking about there, also some clarifications in the accountability system. When we look at the college and career and military readiness, we clarified what IBCs can be added, when they can be added or removed, that they must relate to high wage and high skill standards. Talking about, you mentioned military earlier. We also have now that junior ROTC will be a graded score on their accountability system for military readiness, and that also all of those other CCMRs must be weighted based on correlation with post-secondary success. There are things that relate to CCMR, but they're just not very correlated, and so it'll be weighted based, so that when districts are getting points in their CCMR, it's going to be heavily weighted on things that have geared towards success. And then, you mentioned CCMR again, and I'll some of the highlights of that. We have a Texas Success Initiative test that's graded on that to make sure that our students are ready for college without need for remediation. We look at dual credit, AP, IB, associate degrees, the IBCs that I mentioned, and what level 1 or level 2 certificates are earned. And then again, enlisting in the armed services is something we put a lot of value in.
It sounds like Texas is actually being very progressive in terms of what you're doing in order to make students ready to go on to that next step, which is, I think, fantastic. In terms of the local empowerment, because it's important that Texas values what people do at a local level and provide some flexibility. How are districts leveraging that autonomy to interpret and implement initiatives designed to prepare students for futures in ways that reflect their unique local communities?
Sure. In the state of Texas, the law states that if there's any authority not specifically given to the Texas Education Agency, is the authority of local school board. So sure. Local school boards have all authority unless it's been expressly given to the TEA. Years ago, charter schools became more and more prevalent, and charter schools have, the idea behind them is they're incubators of innovation. And so they had, less requirements and less guidelines. And then the argument was made was, well, if it's good enough for charter schools, why is that same thing not good enough for our traditional ISDs? So years ago, the state came up with what was called districts of innovation. And what that is essentially districts could exempt themselves. These do not have to be approved by the TEA. TEA just has to be notified on some of the regulations, specifically, for example, the calendar. Charter schools had more authority over when they could start the school year and when the school could end, but local ISDs had a very specific set date, the fourth Monday in August. It couldn't start before that. So now, if you apply to be a district of innovation, you can have more control over your calendar, also in teacher contracts. Now, I do know that there would be a lot of districts in Texas who would argue with the autonomy that they're feeling right now from our state legislature, but it is definitely a balance between these two. Is the state looking for certain goals and what we want to see from our students that are ready to enter the workforce when they graduate, and that autonomy for the local school districts. But it's for those local school districts, they have that focus on what programs, what courses, what endorsements they offer, the choice of the curriculum that they use, what programs, whether an ag program is more relevant for their local community, whether it's a STEM focus, technology, et cetera, and then how they staff and compensate their educators. And there's a program I'll talk about hopefully sometime today about the teacher incentive allotment and how we're trying to keep our teachers in the classroom and compensate them accordingly.
Just as a quick reminder to everyone that's listening, we will be doing or viewing a webinar with Dr. Ellis and Lisa Omasta from learning.com, as well as Harry Knutson from Whiteboard Advisor on December 17th. Please sign up. You'll get a chance to hear how some of these great opportunities, these policies are coming to that the states have now more control of, and how it's shifting the paradigm in education. I want to shift slightly to partnerships with industry, which is an important part of all communities. What role do Texas employers, industry partners, and the business community play in shaping the competencies that a graduation needs there in Texas?
Yeah, I mentioned the tri-agency task force earlier, and again, that's with the Texas Education Agency, the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board, and the Workforce Commission, and that agency is focused on pathways. In fact, they came up with what's called the Texas Regional Pathway Network. And that's a network that focuses on regional needs. For example, we're not going to have programs in the panhandle of Texas that focuses on shipbuilding. What are the local needs of a region, and what are we doing to those students in those schools to help meet those needs? That regional pathway is also looking at credentials of value, to make sure that we're having applied academics, effective advising. There are so many different options for students when they leave high school, to make sure that those students know what opportunities that are out there. And then also work-based learning is critical now too. The network came up with a credential library. So there's now a website you can go to that has a compilation of every single type of education program, from institutes of higher education, community colleges, other areas where you can get credentials associated with any of these programs. So easy for a student to go through, look at what type of program, what type of credentials they're looking for, and see where that's offered. Years ago, of course, you were going to figure out where you were going to go to college, and a lot of times now you can pick up a college course here and there from almost anywhere. So having that sort of resource, I think, is important too.
And how do you support teachers, administrators, and support staff across the state to translate some of this vision into day-to-day instruction and effective classroom practice?
Yeah, and that's so important, and something that we focus a lot on. The teaching profession is, it goes without saying, it's obviously critical. highly, highly rewarding profession, but also highly demanding. It's not easy to be a teacher these days. And, the state focus has been on pathways into the classroom. If we just break down the different pathways in Texas, probably from the simplest is just an uncertified teacher. That's the cheapest way to get one, but you get what you pay for. Those uncertified teachers, most of the time, have no classroom experience at all. Moving up the ladder, we have the alternative certified teachers, which is still not as it's less costly. We are almost 70% alt cert teachers here in Texas. That's not a goal. That's not by design. It's just been a function of where our workforce is right now and where our schools are at. Those alt cert teachers have the coursework and they have the early field-based classroom experience, but not a lot of other support past that. A little more costly is what I look at as the traditional undergraduate ed prep programs. Again, they have that coursework, they have that early field-based classroom experience, and they also get typically a semester-long student teaching experience. And then more recently, we've developed a teacher residency program, which is the most expensive. Again, has that coursework, that early field-based classroom experience, but a year-long teacher residency. So I think our mission and goal should be to figure out a way to scale it up, bring that cost down for teacher residencies. I mentioned how many alt certs we have. We've also, just in the past year or two, had a huge increase in the number of uncertified teachers. But we know that 2/3 of uncertified teachers are going to leave the profession within 5 years versus only 1/3 of a traditional cert. I just saw a study that just came out from a general education researcher from Texas Tech named Dr. Kirksey. And he looked at in ed prep programs, when the person participates that virtually versus in person, the virtual had a higher rate of exiting the profession or at an earlier rate. So we know all these things are critical. So what's Texas doing? We passed just this last legislative session, House Bill 2. That's about $4 to $5 billion of new money into the teaching profession each year moving forward into the near future. Some of that money is going for a teacher preparation allotment, what I was just talking about there, the challenges we're having in teacher prep. There's a one-time payment for uncertified teachers to become certified. The state's covering the fees for a lot of these certification programs. The HB2 also has a teacher incentive allotment. That's a way to reward our best teachers, our highest rated teachers, and a pathway to make six figures. We actually have Texas teachers, not Texas administrators, not superintendents and principals, but actually classroom teachers now making six figures in the state of Texas. And they're doing that when we've been able to incentivize whether they're going to a rural school or a high SES school. There's also a goal for teacher retention, just for teachers staying in the field for 5 years, where there's finances and bonuses just to stay a teacher. We want to make sure that we try to decrease that churn that districts are facing. We've rewarded teachers also in allowing them to have more control over the discipline in their classroom. We had a teacher survey, and that was one of the biggest concerns we heard from our teachers is a lack of support and the discipline that they know is necessary in their classroom. And then other things like math academies were in that, and additional day school year. And what that is, we call the ADSY. Districts automatically get an extra 30 days of school funding to go from the traditional 180-day school year to a 210. So any of the students that need that extra time, no questions asked, districts get funded an extra 30 days if they're students that districts feel need that.
Wow. And is there value in placed for teachers who have prior experience? Let's say you have someone that had 20 years of industry experience. They come in, they want to become a teacher. How does Texas handle that, and how do you value that person?
Yeah, and I mentioned that 70% of our teachers right now are alt cert, and some of it's that. So when we look at alt cert, the studies have also showed that it's not clear cut whether a traditional ed prep teacher is going to have better outcomes than an alt cert. A lot of alt cert teachers have just as good outcomes. And that alt cert is what you're talking about. If someone was a welder and wants to go teach welding, if someone was a police officer and wants to teach criminal justice, that's the best pathway for them to get through into a classroom, because they already have that experience. And so that's another area why you're seeing such a high increase in the number of alt certs, because that's the best pathway for them to get in the classroom when you have that expertise.
It's good to see the value there. I know my wife was a mid-career change from being a designer for corporations to becoming a teacher, and it wasn't quite as valued here in Connecticut. And I wish some of that will change. I know that being in this edtech space and trying to help out, trying to advise, we're trying to push forward to make some changes, because it is really important to get people from industry. And I'm glad to hear Texas is putting a lot of value on those alt certs, because there's that experience, you just can't recreate it at a college level.
Right. I agree.
So challenges in terms of implementation, given the size and diversity of the districts and the students' needs, what has been the biggest challenge or key lessons learned in moving from a state level vision to a classroom action?
Yeah, and I truly believe, and to answer that question, local control. Local control is critical. Vision statements, mission statements are important, but vision statements don't teach kids, teachers do. And a big way that we have to reward our teachers is through funding for our schools. Students have different needs and they require a different amount of funding. So that's one thing we do, is we have support, for example, small and mid-sized schools. That's just an economy of scale issue, that if a small school is going to only have 5 kids who need calculus, the calculus teacher is still just as costly as if you got a full classroom. So we have ways that we deal with that. Compensatory ed, we have a sliding scale that it's one thing to teach a child from a low income background. It's a whole different thing to teach a classroom full of children. So we have a sliding scale on compensatory ed funding. And then also teacher retention. It's hard to recruit teachers to rural areas. And so we've had other programs, for example, like a Grow Your Own program that we've pushed hard and looked to find success in.
I think there's been some controversy on equity and access with Texas. I'm sure you understand the comment. How is Texas ensuring that all students, whether in remote areas or inner city schools or underserved communities, have equitable access to developing these future-ready skills?
Yeah, without diving too deep into that, I think part of the problem we're having in this country is just how we define terms. And in terms like equity and access, unfortunately mean different things to different people. But when I look at equity, for example, I go to special education. Special education in my mind is exactly what equity is. But I think, to answer your question, the purpose and idea is that's why we have locally elected school boards. And the state has to provide funding and resources for those school boards. And important in that is the funding formula. If you go back to 2018, Texas had the School Finance Commission, of what I served on. We had 6 legislators, we had 6 lay community members, and 1 member from the State Board of Education, and that was myself. And that School Finance Commission in 2018 led to the largest infusion of new money into Texas public schools with HB 3 in 2019. But the report that we commissioned was titled Funding for Students Who Need It the Most. And I talked just a second ago about compensatory education and how we developed a sliding scale that the more kids that you had from low economic backgrounds, the more compensation districts got for educating those kids. I also mentioned special education. We focused on things like just flat out improving funding for them, improving the screening for that, having multidisciplinary support teams for them. So those are other areas that we work with funding. So I already mentioned the additional day school year, all those types of things. But the state provides the resource, and the local districts have to focus on what's critical for the students they serve.
And in what ways do you see technology, digital learning, and these emerging tools like artificial intelligence fitting into the Texas picture of preparing students for college and career?
Yeah, and I'd answer that question saying almost everything we do in education is about finding a balance. And I would also say that, those things you mentioned, the technology, the digital learning, AI, it's not the future. It's the right now. This is what we're dealing with right now. Now, I'm not ready to put our Texas students in front of an AI learning system. In fact, we had a proposal with a charter school that for 2 hours a day they'd be in front of literally an AI learning system, and they didn't call their teachers teachers; they called them facilitators. I don't think I'm ready for that yet. On the flip side, we can't go back to pencils, papers, and chalkboard. So again, it's all about a balance. And when I think about balance in an area like this, I'll go to a math discussion we had, and Hillary will be very familiar with this because we've talked about this. In the math, there's a concept of, can students just do the problems? Can they accurately and fluently solve math problems? And then the other side is they have to make sure that they conceptually understand what they're doing. So there's this balance between fluency and accuracy and conceptual understanding. Well, right now we can pick our cell phone up and put it over a math problem, and that phone will solve the math problem for me. I don't have to know how to do it. That phone will do it for me. So if all we do is teach our kids how to solve math problems, we're teaching them something that can be done very simply with their phone. So they do have to know how to solve those math problems, but they also have to understand what that math problem means, what the answer means, what the process means. So I think, going back to my first statement, is all these things, there's a balance. We have to make sure that we use these tools that are here now, again, not the future, but we have to make sure that we still keep the traditional learning that students just have to know in the meantime.
I would agree. Critical thinking is a key ingredient to any kind of success in education. If the student doesn't understand how to think critically, then they're not going to know how to apply anything. So it sounds like Texas is making the right strides. As part of the discussion is the policy levers that Texas or any state really has, and to build some of the systems that are in place. What are the state levers there at Texas, such as funding formulations, graduation plan designs, accountability incentives, et cetera, and partnerships that have been most effective in advancing some of the future-ready agendas that you have?
First and foremost, I'd say reading academies. That was a big push the legislature focused us on a couple of years ago. It was teachers had 3 years to complete this program. It was just recently wrapped up last year. But every teacher, not just reading teachers, but every teacher K through 3 had to go through a year-long intensive training on phonics. And it was tough because it put a lot of pressure on them to get this done. But I think overall it's gonna pay off. And additionally, we made sure that got pushed into the ed prep programs. If we trained all our current Texas teachers on the science of reading and on phonics, but then our ed prep programs weren't doing that, we'd continually have this infusion of new teachers in the state that weren't trained on that. So not only does every teacher K through 3 went through a reading academy, it's also required to be taught in the ed prep programs. One thing I love to talk about that I think has been very effective too is high quality instruction material. And I don't think any other state is truly doing HQIM like Texas is, but an incredible amount of resources into determining what is high quality instruction material and then incentivizing districts. What I love about what Texas did is there's 2 ways to effectuate change. You can do it with a carrot and you can do it with a stick. And what I mean by that is a carrot is an incentive and a stick is a punishment. And the way Texas did it is they provided funding. That's the biggest carrot of them all. And that if Texas districts are using high quality instruction material, there's additional funding for them. Professional development is key in that HQIM. We've done that. I already mentioned the Texas teacher incentive allotment and the additional day school year. Those are all things that have been very productive in advancing the goals that we have for our future ready students. But I say there's no silver bullet. I don't know who I stole this phrase from, but I've heard it said there's no silver bullet in education. And the reason that there's no silver bullet in education is we're not hunting werewolves. We're trying to grow our youngest children at 5 years old, that at the time that they graduate high school, they're ready to become productive members of our society. And it's not an easy thing to do, but those are some of the things that we're focusing on.
Well, they're good things to focus on. And, you're talking about success. Let's give some kudos or shout outs to the districts that are, making some measurable change. And can you point to a few and what can other districts learn from these successful implementations?
Sure. There's one in particular here. I live in East Texas, and just maybe a month or so ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, the commissioner toured the state after the most recent accountability ratings were released, and he focused on touring schools that performed exceptionally well with a high population of economically disadvantaged students. And Gilmer ISD, a district a little bit north of me, was one of those ones that he toured, but there were 8 or 9 across the state that he wanted to focus, and he traveled to each of those to do this. So we look at those districts. We try to look at the things that they're doing right. And when we fully solve for this, I'll make sure to let you know, because I think truly that's what every state board of education in the country, what every school district, what every principal, whatever teachers doing across this country, to try to find those right tools, those right metrics to look at, that we have that success. So I'm not sure exactly what the formula is that's going to lead to that for districts across the country, but I can tell you one thing that I know that typically leads to poor outcome, and that's poor leadership. We know how important leadership is, and poor board leadership will almost guarantee poor outcome. So we got to continue to focus on the positives we had and make sure that we're providing leadership for our students with the adults in the room.
Just a couple more questions. Kevin, I want to look ahead on some of this, but I just want to remind the audience that we will be doing a webinar with Kevin and Lisa Omasta from learning.com and Hillary Knudsen from Whiteboard Advisor on December 17th. Please click the link below, sign up. It's going to be a great conversation. And we'll have Dr. Ellis back to talk about some of these points, and then we can balance it out with other perspectives. Kevin, if we're looking ahead, the next phase of work for Texas, what's ahead for Future Ready Learning Agenda?
Yeah, I think, when we look at that, I've really touched on these, I think, already, but just to highlight them from the board's perspective, there's a huge focus on HQIM. It's a huge focus of what we're doing, and we spend a lot of our time. In fact, in our meeting here in 2 weeks, we're going to be going through the reviews for the 2025 instruction materials and voting on those, which ones will be considered HQIM. So there's a lot of time and effort we're spending on that. That's a big State Board of Education priority. Also, doing a lot with math, advanced middle school math. There was a bill that was passed that said that 40% of the top in mathematics, either on their local test or on the state test for Texas 5th graders, must be placed on a pathway to complete Algebra 1 in 8th grade. So the board has focused on coming up with new curriculum standards, not just for the 8th grade algebra, which we already had, but now we've got to teach what was in 6th and 7th and 8th grade math now in 6th and 7th, so that they can take math, Algebra 1 in 8th grade. I talked about the redesign of STAAR for quicker feedback. I think that's going to be critical. And then again, the funding support for teachers are all the things that we're going to be prioritizing.
Yeah, excellent. In closing, your personal perspectives as someone who has served both at the local and state levels, what inspires you the most about this vision for Texas and its potential impact for your learners?
I'd say it's top to bottom, north, south, east, west. It's everybody. It's our state leadership. It's our legislators. It's my state board colleagues. It's TEA staff. It's district administrators. It's teachers. It's parents and students, all being willing to put in the hard work it takes to do what we're talking about today. One of the biggest difference, I mentioned I served on a local school board, now the State Board of Education, is when I was on the local school board, you get to put your arm around the specific student and know that you're helping that student right there. And you lose that a lot when you get on a state board. But on the flip side, we're getting to make policy decisions that affect our 5.5 million students in the state of Texas. And that's just incredibly important work to be focusing on right now.
Final takeaway for you, Kevin, is there any one message that you'd like educators, policymakers, edtech partners to understand how Texas is preparing this next generation of graduates for life, work, and citizenship?
Yeah, I'd say to focus on the one thing is just to focus on everything. You have to, I mentioned special ed, compensatory ed, English language learners. You have to focus on our standards and on our curriculum, on our literacy and on our numeracy, on our teacher recruiting and our teacher attainment, because this work is not just 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, September to May. It's all day, every day, year after year. And we do this, Rich, because our students are worth it. And that's why we're all working together for one goal.
Well, I'm Rich Portelance for the EdGate Powers podcast. Dr. Keven Ellis, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it. This was insightful and informative, and I look forward to talking to you more on our webinar coming up in a couple weeks.
Looking forward to that. Thanks a lot, Rich.
Thank you, sir.